What happens when a country spends 30 years building an air defense network and it still isn't fast enough to save its own soldiers? That's the question Iran woke up to on a July morning in 2026, and by the time anyone in Tehran understood the answer, it was already too late. Before we go further, hit that like button right now, not because I'm asking nicely, but because this channel only survives if people like you decide this story deserves 5 seconds of your time. Subscribe if you want the next one delivered straight to you. Now let's get into what actually happened. It's just past 5 in the morning in the Gulf of Oman. The water is dark and flat. Somewhere out past the horizon, invisible to anyone standing on the Iranian coast, a United States Navy ship is holding a fixed course. Not hiding, not sneaking, just waiting, because everything it's about to do has already been planned down to the second. 400 kilometers inland, past mountains and desert, sits a town called Bampur in Iran's Sistan and Baluchistan province. It's not a famous place. Most people outside Iran had never heard its name before this week. Inside its walls is a base belonging to the 388th Mechanized Brigade of the Iranian Army. Regular soldiers, not the elite forces that usually make headlines. Men who eat breakfast in the same mess hall every morning, who write letters home, who have spent the last several weeks watching this war get closer without ever thinking it would knock on their own door. They believed distance was protection. 400 kilometers felt like a wall. It wasn't. At the ship, a weapons crew runs through a final check. Then the first launcher fires. A rocket motor ignites with a burst of white fire that turns the black sky orange for a fraction of a second. Then a second launch, a third, a fourth. Within less than a minute, 13 missiles are climbing away from the ship, arcing northwest, aimed at coordinates that were locked in long before this morning began. Nobody at that base hears a warning siren. Nobody gets a phone call. The men sleeping in that barracks have no idea that a targeting decision made weeks earlier, in a briefing room thousands of kilometers away, is about to end their morning early. This is the story of how it happened, why Iran's defenses couldn't stop it, and what it tells us about the next phase of this war. Stick with me, because the second half of this explains something most people watching this conflict from the outside still don't understand. To really understand what happened that morning, you have to understand what this war actually is. Because by mid-2026, it had already stopped being a short exchange of strikes and turned into something much longer and much heavier. It began earlier that year with a sudden coordinated wave of attacks that killed senior Iranian leadership and triggered months of retaliation across the region. Since then, missiles have crossed borders in both directions. Bahrain has been hit. The United Arab Emirates has been hit. Jordan has intercepted drones flying through its airspace. Tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz have been boarded, disabled, or redirected under an active naval blockade. This isn't a single dramatic night. It's a slow grind that had already been running for months by the time this particular strike happened, one where both sides had learned, adjusted, and escalated repeatedly. That context matters, because it explains why a base 400 kilometers inland ever became a target in the first place. Earlier waves of strikes had already worked through the coastline, hitting cruise missile sites, radar installations, and command centers close to the water. Bampur represented something new, a strike reaching past all of that, into the country's interior, against a conventional army unit that had nothing directly to do with the missile and drone attacks that had been hitting American ships for weeks. It was a message as much as it was a military operation, and everyone on both sides understood it that way immediately. Let's rewind slightly, because to understand why this strike worked, you need to understand what Iran was actually facing on paper. On the American side, the missile involved here is called the Precision Strike Missile, and it's the newest weapon of its kind in the U.S. arsenal. It was built to replace an older missile system that had been in service since the 1980s, and it does the job in a way that changes the entire math of missile defense. Each missile can fly further than 300 kilometers. It travels at roughly 3 times the speed of sound in its final approach. It uses a laser-based internal guidance system combined with GPS updates that correct its position constantly during flight. And unlike older missiles that follow a simple curved path, like a ball thrown through the air, this one steers. It manages its own trajectory, staying lower than a normal arc, and it keeps adjusting its course all the way down to the target. It doesn't just fall, it aims itself the entire way. That single detail is the difference between a predictable weapon and an unpredictable one. Older air defense systems were built around a simple idea. If you know where something launches from, and you know the laws of physics, you can calculate exactly where it's going to land the moment it leaves the ground. That's how missile defense worked for decades. But a weapon that keeps steering during its descent breaks that math completely. The defender isn't tracking a falling object anymore. He's chasing a moving target that refuses to follow a clean, predictable line. Think of it like this. Defending against a normal ballistic missile is a bit like catching a ball thrown in a straight arc. You watch where it leaves. The thrower's hand You calculate the curve, and you put your glove exactly where the math says it will land. Defending against a missile like this one is like trying to catch that same ball after someone told it to change direction twice on the way down. Your first calculation is already wrong before you've even moved your glove into position. Multiply that problem by 13 incoming objects, all doing it at once. You start to understand just how badly this kind of attack breaks a traditional defense system. Now here's where the real strategy shows up, and it's the part that made this particular strike so difficult to stop. The ship didn't fire all 13 missiles at once from the exact same second. It staggered them, spacing the launches out over roughly 40 seconds. But it aimed each one on a slightly different path, timed so precisely that despite launching over almost a minute, all 13 missiles were built to arrive at the target within the same 10-second window. Think about what that means for whoever is trying to defend against it. If missiles came in one at a time, spread out over minutes, a defense battery would get repeated chances to shoot each one down individually. But when 13 threats slam into the same narrow window together, the defender doesn't get 13 separate problems to solve. He gets one impossible problem all at once, with almost no time to choose what to prioritize. It's the same principle military planners have relied on for generations, just executed with modern missiles instead of old artillery. Concentrate your fire in time, not just in space, and you overwhelm the system meant to stop you. If this kind of breakdown is something you want more of, drop a comment telling me what part surprised you the most, and consider sharing this video with one person who follows this conflict closely. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now, back to Bampur. The moment those 13 missiles lit up the sky, Iran's coastal radar systems picked up the launch signature almost instantly. Infrared sensors catch a rocket motor, burning the second it fires, and that light travels at the speed of light, so there's no delay in detection. Within seconds, Iranian radar operators along the coast knew something had launched, and roughly from where. But knowing something launched and being able to actually stop it are two very different problems. Iran's first line of detection out here is a long-range, over-the-horizon radar system that bounces signals off the upper atmosphere to see beyond the curve of the Earth. On paper, it can theoretically detect activity thousands of kilometers away. In practice, that kind of radar comes with a serious trade-off. Its accuracy on both range and direction is loose, sometimes off by tens of kilometers, and its picture only refreshes every 30 to 60 seconds. It's excellent for raising an early alarm. It's almost useless for actually guiding a missile to intercept a target, because by the time it updates again, the target has already moved far beyond where the last reading placed it. A second, more advanced radar system further inland gives Iran a sharper picture with real three-dimensional tracking that includes altitude, not just direction and rough distance. That's a major upgrade over the coastal system, and it can reportedly see out past 1,000 kilometers. But even this radar was designed primarily as an early warning tool, built to tell commanders that something is coming, not to feed real-time targeting data precise enough to actually direct an interceptor missile into a fast-moving target's path. To do that, you need dedicated fire control radar, positioned close to the actual interceptor batteries, refreshing its picture multiple times every second. And that's where Iran's real problem begins, because the gap between detecting a threat and actually being cleared to shoot at it is filled with something no radar can speed up: permission. In Iran's air defense structure, a launch detection doesn't simply trigger an automatic response. It has to travel up a chain of command, first to a regional command post, then off into a national headquarters, sometimes in Tehran itself, before authorization to fire comes back down to the actual battery crew sitting at their launch station. Every one of those steps takes time. Confirmation calls, verification checks, sign-offs. None of it is instant, and all of it adds up. Compare that to the American side of this exchange, where the decision to strike wasn't made in the moment at all. It was made weeks earlier, during planning sessions when target coordinates were confirmed, verified, and locked in well before that ship ever took position in the Gulf. On the morning of the strike, there was no debate, no waiting for a phone call up a chain of command. The system had already been cleared to fire the second conditions were met. The human decision-making had already happened. All that remained was execution. That difference in speed, planned execution against real-time permission-seeking, is the actual heart of this story. It's not really about which missile is faster or which radar sees further. It's about which side has already finished making its decisions before the fight even starts. This isn't a new idea in military history either. Armies have understood the value of pre-planned action over reactive decision-making for a very long time. What's different now is the timescale. 100 years ago, that advantage was measured in hours or days, the time it took a telegram to reach headquarters and a response to travel back. Today, that same advantage is measured in seconds, and a system that used to be considered fast enough in an earlier era of warfare can now find itself hopelessly outpaced by an opponent who simply finished thinking earlier. by the time an Iranian battery near the target actually received clearance to engage. Close to a third of the missile's total flight time had already ticked away. Out of roughly 5 minutes in the air, nearly 90 seconds were gone before any interceptor crew even had legal authorization to fire a single shot. Now, picture the crew manning one of Iran's medium-range air defense systems positioned along the likely approach route. These are capable systems. They've had real success this year, reportedly bringing down American surveillance drones earlier in the conflict. But every weapon has limits, and this one has a hard ceiling. Its interceptors can only climb to an altitude of around 25 to 30 kilometers before running out of reach. The American missiles, meanwhile, were cruising through the thin upper atmosphere at nearly 3 times that height during the middle portion of their flight, completely untouchable, sailing through a layer of sky this particular system was never built to defend. The only moment this battery could realistically engage was in the final seconds of the missile's descent, when they finally dropped low enough to enter range, and that window was brutally short. Once you subtract the time it takes an interceptor to climb up to meet an incoming target, the crew was left with somewhere around 40 usable seconds to try to stop an incoming wave of 13 separate threats, using a launcher that could only track a handful of targets at once. Do the math yourself. Even a battery firing perfectly, hitting every single shot it takes, still can't stop 13 simultaneous targets with only a few available launch channels. The outcome wasn't really decided in that final minute. It was decided back when the strike was designed to overwhelm exactly this kind of gap. If you're finding value in this breakdown, do me a favor and hit subscribe before you scroll away. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you want more videos exactly like this one. Now let's talk about what actually happened when those missiles arrived. As the missiles began their final descent, something changed. Their rocket motors, which had been burning fuel to push them up to speed, ran dry roughly 90 seconds into the flight. The moment that fuel is gone, the bright infrared signature that ground radar had been tracking simply disappears. No exhaust plume, no heat trail. From that point forward, the missiles are effectively invisible to a lot of the sensors trying to follow them, flying silent and dark through the upper atmosphere. This is also the point where the missiles begin actively steering toward their final targets, using onboard guidance instead of the momentum from launch. There's no camera in the nose of these weapons, no live video feed watching the ground below. Instead, they rely entirely on inertial sensors that track the missile's own movement, corrected once, every second by GPS. It's closer to a blindfolded expert walking a route they've memorized down to the centimeter than a weapon that can actually see where it's going. And because the target coordinates were surveyed in advance with extreme accuracy, the blind guidance was enough. The barracks buildings at Bampur are roughly 30 to 50 meters across. Reports since the strike suggest the missiles landed with accuracy tight enough to hit specific buildings inside that compound, not just the general area, because these missiles travel at roughly 3 times the speed of sound. Something strange happens in the final seconds before impact. Sound simply cannot keep up. The shockwave trails behind the missile in a narrow cone, which means the missile itself arrives at its target before the sound of it approaching ever reaches the ground. For anyone standing near that base, the first indication something was wrong wasn't a whistle or a roar building in the distance. It was the impact itself, arriving in near silence, followed only afterward by the sound catching up. Iranian point defense guns at the base did manage to react. Automated tracking systems picked up part of the incoming wave and opened fire, throwing rapid bursts of rounds into the sky in an attempt to shoot something down at close range. But those systems are built to intercept slower, lower targets approaching on a predictable path, not weapons diving in at several times the speed of sound with the ability to adjust their own course in the final moments. The defense fired, it's confirmed, but it wasn't fast enough or accurate enough to change the outcome. According to reporting from Iranian state media in the days after the strike, 13 missiles struck the compound at Bampur, hitting dormitory buildings, guard posts, and a guest house used by personnel. Iran's army confirmed 7 soldiers were killed, with additional personnel wounded, and some local reports at the time suggested the toll may have been higher. This wasn't a strike on an isolated missile launcher or a lone radar site out in the desert. This was a hit on a populated barracks holding regular army soldiers, hundreds of kilometers from the coastline that had, until that morning, felt like a safe distance. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. For most of this conflict up to that point, American and Allied strikes had largely focused on coastal defenses, missile and drone launch sites, and facilities tied to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Bampur was different. It hit a conventional army unit, deep in Iran's interior, in a province far removed from the usual front lines of this war. It sent a message that no part of the country, regardless of distance from the coast, was truly out of reach anymore. There's also a human side to this that's easy to lose in the technical breakdown of missiles and radar systems. The soldiers stationed at Bampur weren't commanders directing this war, and they weren't the men launching the drone and missile attacks that had been hitting American ships in the weeks before. Many of them were regular conscripts, ordinary young men doing mandatory service far from the coastline in a province that had felt disconnected from the fighting. Until that morning. Local reports described an emergency call for blood donations in the nearby town of Iranshar in the hours after the strike, and accounts from residents described a level of damage and confusion far beyond what a short official statement could capture. War reporting from any conflict tends to reduce events like this into numbers. 7 killed, several wounded, 13 missiles. Behind every one of those numbers is a family that woke up that same morning to news they never expected to receive. We're about halfway through this story, and I promise the next part explains exactly why Iran's options going forward are so limited. Before we get there, if this video has held your attention this long, tap that like button now. It's a small thing on your end, but it tells this channel that stories like this one are worth telling in more detail. Let's keep going. In Tehran, the reaction to Bampur wasn't just about the number of casualties. It was about what the strike proved. For years, Iran's military doctrine had leaned heavily on the idea that its geography and its layered air defense network gave it real strategic depth, space and time to detect, react, and respond to any threat before it could do serious damage deep inside the country. Bampur broke that assumption in a single morning. Iran's army publicly vowed a decisive response after the strike. And days later, Iranian forces did retaliate, launching missile attacks toward American assets across the region, including reported strikes on facilities in the Gulf. But retaliation and deterrence are two very different things. Iran could still hit back. What it couldn't do was stop the next strike from landing exactly like this one did. That's the uncomfortable reality this single morning exposed. Over the months leading up to this point, American and Allied forces had been steadily working through Iran's outer layers of air defense, targeting longer-range systems along the coast in earlier waves of strikes throughout the year. By the time the Bampur strike happened, many of the coastal batteries capable of reaching far out into the Gulf, the systems that might have threatened the ship before it ever got close enough to fire, had already been degraded or destroyed in earlier rounds of fighting. What remained were medium-range systems better suited to defending airspace closer to the ground, not the kind of high-altitude, long-range coverage needed to catch a missile like this one cruising through the upper atmosphere. This is why the story of Bampur isn't really about one missile system beating one air defense system in a single engagement. It's about a slow, methodical campaign that had already stripped away Iran's best options long before this particular morning began. The strike on the barracks wasn't the beginning of Iran's vulnerability. It was proof of how far that vulnerability had already progressed. And here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone watching this conflict closely. This wasn't a one-time demonstration built around some rare, limited weapon that America can only use sparingly. Ships like the one involved in this strike can carry dozens of these missiles at once, and there's more than one of these ships operating in the region. The tactic used here, staggered launches converging into one impact window, isn't some experimental trick either. It's a repeatable method that can be applied again against other targets whenever it's decided to do so. It's also worth pointing out that this isn't just an Iranian problem. Militaries around the world are watching how this played out, because the same layered, permission-heavy command structure that failed to protect Bampur in time is used, in some form, by a lot of countries that assume they have more time to react than they actually do. Any nation whose air defense relies on multiple human checkpoints before a missile can fire is looking at this exact same vulnerability. Speed of decision-making has quietly become just as important as the raw performance specs of the weapons themselves, and that's a lesson with implications well beyond this one conflict. That leaves Iran with an incredibly narrow set of choices. It can try to force American ships out of the Gulf entirely through pressure or negotiation, which so far hasn't worked and shows no clear sign of working, or it can attempt to build and deploy an air defense network capable of reaching higher altitudes, tracking multiple maneuvering targets simultaneously, and cutting its own decision-making chain down to a matter of seconds instead of minutes. Both of those are massive undertakings, the kind that normally take years of investment, testing, and deployment, not something a country can simply build in the middle of an active, ongoing war. There is a third option, and it's the one that Iranian officials have actually started hinting at publicly in the weeks following this strike, shifting the country's overall military posture from defensive to what some Iranian commanders have openly called fully offensive. In practical terms, that means less emphasis on trying to intercept every incoming strike and more emphasis on trying to make each strike costly enough through retaliation elsewhere that the other side reconsiders continuing. It's a strategy built on raising the price of the war rather than winning individual battles inside it. And it's a sign of just how limited Iran's direct defensive options have become. None of this happened by accident. And none of it happened overnight. This moment at Bampur was the visible result of months of planning, positioning, and a level of systemic advantage that had been building long before that missile ever left its launcher. And it isn't just Iran and the countries directly involved in this war who are studying what happened that morning. Military analysts in Moscow and Beijing are almost certainly running the same numbers, watching how a modern, layered command structure held up against a weapon specifically engineered to exploit the gap between detection and authorization. Every major military power on Earth is, in some form, wrestling with the same trade-off: how much human oversight to keep in a defense system versus how much speed that oversight ends up costing when seconds are all that separate a successful intercept from a direct hit. Bampur didn't just answer a question about Iran's defenses. It handed the rest of the world a live case study in exactly where the line between the two currently sits. Before we wrap this up, here's something a little different for you. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this war is actually unfolding, not just the headlines. So do this. Leave one comment telling me which side of this conflict you think has the harder path forward. From here, Iran, or the coalition pressing against it. I read every single one, and the best comments genuinely shape what I cover next on this channel. What happened at Bampur wasn't really about one missile, or one radar system, or one battery commander making the wrong call. Under pressure. Every individual piece of Iran's defense that morning worked roughly the way it was designed to work. Radar operators detected the launch, command centers processed the information, battery crews received their orders, and fired when they were cleared to. Nobody failed at their job in the way that word usually implies. What failed was the system connecting all of those pieces together, a chain built for a slower kind of war, tested against a weapon designed specifically to exploit exactly that kind of delay. Iran's soldiers executed the only plan available to them. The plan itself simply wasn't fast enough for the moment it was asked to survive. And that's really the story underneath the story. Wars aren't only won or lost on the day the missiles fly. They're shaped for months beforehand in planning rooms far from any battlefield, where someone decides exactly how a system will be tested and exactly which weaknesses it will be built to expose. By the morning, those 13 missiles lit up the sky over the Gulf of Oman. The outcome? Bampur had, in every meaningful sense, already been decided. Iran now has to operate inside a war where distance no longer guarantees safety, and where the speed of a decision matters just as much as the weapon behind it. That reality doesn't disappear once the smoke clears from one strike. It's the new baseline for everything that comes after it. As of mid-August, Iranian officials were already signaling a shift toward what they've called a fully offensive posture, a sign that Tehran itself understands defense alone can no longer carry the weight it once did. Whether that shift changes the trajectory of this war, or simply invites more strikes like the one at Bampur, is something only the coming months will answer. What's already clear is that the assumptions this war started with, about geography, about depth, about how much warning time really means, have been tested and found wanting in the space of a single dark morning over the Gulf of Oman. If this story helped you understand this conflict a little better than the headlines did, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next chapter of this war as it unfolds, because based on everything we've just walked through, this almost certainly won't be the last morning like this one.